Enlightenment, then, holds an irresistible authority over faith because in the believer's own consciousness are found the very moments which enlightenment has established as valid. Examining the effect of this authority more closely, its behavior towards faith seems to rend asunder the beautiful unity of trust and immediate certainty, to pollute its spiritual consciousness with mean thoughts of sensuous reality, to destroy the soul which is composed and secure in its submission by the vanity of the understanding and of self-will and self-fulfillment. But, as a matter of fact, the result of the Enlightenment is rather to do away with a thoughtless or rather non-notional separation which is present in faith. The believing consciousness weighs and measures by a twofold standard. It has two sorts of eyes, two sorts of ears, speaks with two voices, has duplicated all ideas without comparing the twofold meanings. In other words, faith lives in two sorts of non-notional perceptions. The one, the perceptions of the slumbering consciousness which lives purely in non-notional thoughts. The other, those of the waking consciousness which lives solely in the world of sense. And in each of them it has its own separate housekeeping. The Enlightenment illuminates that heavenly world with ideas belonging to the world of sense and points out this finitude which faith cannot deny, because it is self-consciousness, and hence is the unity to which both kinds of ideas belong, and in which they do not fall apart. For they belong to the same indivisible unitary self into which faith has passed. We've now reached paragraph 572, which is the penultimate paragraph in this section of Spirit, the Enlightenment and its struggle with superstition, which of course the Enlightenment interprets as faith. And one of the things that Hegel has been doing for us over and over again in this section is showing how dynamic the relationship between enlightenment and, or pure insight, if you like, and faith or religious belief and religious institutions has been. Enlightenment has produced this, very complex and thoroughgoing critique of faith, and in doing so has found within itself the capacities to at least partially develop its own perspective, although one that remains to some degree rooted in its predecessor of faith, right? But it's also helped faith in some respect to purify itself. So this is not going to be the very end of religion. As a matter of fact, if you've read ahead in the Phenomenology, you know that there's going to be an entire religion section following this long Spirit portion of the work. So what's going on here? Hegel tells us that enlightenment holds an irresistible authority over faith by this point, right? Why? Because in the believer's own consciousness are found the very moments which enlightenment has established as valid. So here's the thing. Faith cannot be shaken unless it wants to take into account whatever it is that is not faith. So we might think about this in terms of, a religious view on things, and not just view on things, but institution and practices and action, this entire, panoply that goes along with religion. And then what we can call, using the very terminology of faith, the world, right? And at first this was the world of culture, and then it became the world of pure thought, namely the Enlightenment and its critique. Now, if faith wants to be genuine, and it's to be a spiritual faith, treating the human being as essentially the locus where, human being and divinity meet, then it can't just turn its brain off. Although this is what many religious believers attempt to do, right? And there are whole traditions that say, just don't think, just believe. That's never satisfying. And that's even less satisfying when we have these incredible social changes. if faith is actually going to remain faithful not just to its divinity, but also to its own nature, it has to listen to what enlightenment has to say. If it's going to lay claim to honesty, truth, it has to take truth where it finds it. And as it turns out, the Enlightenment has a lot to tell it. So Hegel says, let's examine the effects of this authority more closely. And here we have this sort of schema here, right? Its behavior, Enlightenment's behavior towards faith, he says, seems to rend asunder the beautiful unity of trust and immediate certainty, something that faith was providing to the believer. If the believer allows enlightenment to come in, then they start asking questions. They start realizing the discordance between these, that there isn't a pure unity here. And he says, it seems to pollute its spiritual consciousness with mean thoughts, right? Degrading, low thoughts. Of what? Sensuous reality. We saw earlier that enlightenment or pure insight takes us back to the sense certainty of the beginning, the very first part of consciousness, but now at a higher level, more developed. It pays attention to the sensuous thing, and it understands spiritual realities as themselves sensuous things. Hegel himself is rather receptive to this. Hegel does think that we live within a world that we perceive with our senses. If there is a spiritual reality, it can't be some ghostly thing, dualistically floating out there, totally cut off from this sensuous reality. It better inhabit it. So how do we make sense of this? Enlightenment is offering a perspective. Sensuous reality, understood through sense certainty. Hegel talks about two other aspects of this, as he's calling it, mean thoughts, right? Destroying the soul that is composed and secure in its submission by the vanity of the understanding, and self-will and self-fulfillment. The Enlightenment, it represents a certain kind of rationality that is being deployed not against an irrationality, but a previous rationality, that of faith. And you might say, wait a second, faith and reason, those are two things almost like oil and water, they don't mix. Well, who are you, Tertullian? Even Tertullian used rational argumentation and exposition in making his claim about Athens and Jerusalem. And there are places where Athens and Jerusalem do in fact meet, and they have to in our day-to-day lives, and they have to whenever we're thinking important things like faith does. There is a rationality involved in the consciousness of faith. Enlightenment is offering what it takes to be a more developed rationality. One that is based on, the understanding. For Hegel, the understanding, by the way, is never going to be something good in its own respect, because we have here an opposition between understanding on the one hand and reason, let's call it reason with a capital R, right? Hegel will actually use in his lectures on the philosophy of religion, philosophies of the understanding as kind of a pejorative comment to talk about philosophies of the Enlightenment. They don't go far enough. They're not conceptual. They're not actually taking in the totality of things. They're great at classifying. They're great at doing a certain kind of analysis, but they aren't sufficiently self-aware, and they don't assimilate their opposites. Rather, they attack them and classify them. Be that as it may, here we're also talking about self-will and self-fulfillment, and the person of enlightenment saying to the person of faith, hey, why don't you behave more rationally when it comes to what you're sacrificing? Does it really, as we saw in the previous paragraphs, does it really make sense for you to fast? Or is that sort of an arbitrary commitment that you made? It's merely symbolic, and it's not really going to get you any surcease, if you like, any ending to this dialectic of desire and pleasure that you're caught up in, even if you starve yourself. So, where do we go from here? Hegel says, as a matter of fact, the result of enlightenment is to purify faith. Faith, at first, looks at enlightenment as if it's destroying faith. But really, it's helping it out. He says the result of enlightenment is to do away with the thoughtless. Remember, what is faith? Faith is pure thought, but it has a tendency to get lost within its own world and its own beyond, right? Turn into a sort of idolatry, taking the statue for being the thing, taking the individual gesture for being a universal sacrifice. So he says, enlightenment does away with the thoughtless, or rather non-notional separation that is present in faith. Non-notional, unbegriffliche, non-conceptual. What makes it non-conceptual? It's not allowing these things to be separated and yet united at the same time. It's saying, look, either they're separated or they're united. I can't think beyond that, and if they're separated, well, everything has fallen apart. No, they get separated, and they also are connected in that very separation, in that relation. Hegel goes on and he says, the believing consciousness weighs and measures by a twofold standard. It has two sets of eyes, two sets of ears, speaks with two voices, has duplicated all ideas without comparing the twofold meanings. What's he talking about there? Why this sort of repetition, two? Because one of the things that happens with religious belief is the sort of projection of a world out there that's the real world. Nietzsche, of course, calls Christianity Platonism for the masses. Hegel could say something quite like that in terms of what he's talking about here in faith. So, there are the eyes that we see with, and then there are the eyes of the heart, or the eyes of the mind. There are the ears that hear at the sort of surface level, and then there are the ears that hear the true meaning behind a parable, right? There are two voices. The voices that one speaks with out here in the world, and then sort of an inner voice. And we can go on and on and on with this. We can talk about, if we want to multiply this metaphor, there are two kinds of monies or talents. There are, two types of fathers or mothers, and go on and on and on with this. And the problem is not, Hegel is saying here, that we do have this bifurcation. The problem is that they're being separated out, and faith is not adequately reconnecting them. So notice that distinction there. The problem is not that they're being separated into two. The problem is that there's no real connection being worked out between them. Plenty of arbitrary connections. You might think, if you know your medieval biblical commentaries, which I don't take for granted that anybody listening or watching this does, but you might think about the abuses of the allegorical method that some commentators got into, where just about anything can mean anything else, right? We want there to be some sort of reason why things are connected to each other. Prime example of this is if you think about the parables within the Gospels. What are these stories supposed to teach? There are, some interesting cases where the one who's giving the parable actually says, okay, let me break this down for you because you might not actually get this. Think about the parable of the sower, where instead of just telling this story about, the grain being sown here and there, and then things happening to it, like the birds coming along and eating it, or, it springs up but it doesn't have any root that stays there, or it does actually prosper, he says, listen, I need to explain this to you. That is conceptual reconnecting, right there. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So he says, what's the result of this? In other words, he says, faith lives in two sorts of non-notional perceptions. The one, the perceptions of the slumbering consciousness, which lives purely in non-notional thoughts, non-conceptual thoughts. The other, that of the waking consciousness, which lives solely in the world of sense. And in each of them, and this is a beautiful metaphor, it has its separate housekeeping. There is no unity here. There is no bringing everything within the same household, the same commensurable way of accounting for things. This is a fundamental problem in Hegel's view. So he says the Enlightenment illuminates that heavenly world with ideas belonging to the world of sense, and that seems bad from the perspective of faith, and it points out this finitude that faith cannot deny. Why? Because, he says, faith is a self-consciousness and hence is the unity to which both kinds of ideas belong and in which they do not fall apart, for they belong to the same indivisible unitary self in which faith has passed. So on perhaps a unconscious level, these dualisms are being maintained, but they're not being conceptually understood, and that's the fundamental problem. As a result, faith has lost the content which filled its element and collapses into a state in which it moves listlessly to and fro within itself. It has been expelled from its kingdom, or this kingdom has been ransacked, since the waking consciousness has monopolized every distinction and expansion of it and has vindicated Earth's ownership of every portion of it and given them back to Earth. Yet faith is not on that account satisfied, for this illumination has everywhere brought to light only single separate entities, so that what speaks to spirit is only a reality without any substance, and a finitude forsaken by spirit. Since faith is without any content, and it cannot remain in this void or sense in going beyond the finite, which is the sole content, it finds only the void. It is a sheer yearning, its truth an empty beyond, for which a fitting content can no longer be found, for everything is bestowed elsewhere. Faith has, in fact, become the same as enlightenment, that is, the consciousness of the relation of what is in itself finite to an absolute without predicates, an absolute unknown and unknowable. But there is this difference. The latter is satisfied enlightenment, but faith is unsatisfied enlightenment. However, we shall see whether enlightenment can remain satisfied. That yearning of the troubled spirit which mourns over the loss of its spiritual world lurks in the background. Enlightenment itself bears within it this blemish of an unsatisfied yearning, as pure object in its empty absolute being, as action and movement in going beyond its individual self to an empty and unfulfilled beyond, as an object with a content, in the lack of selfhood in the thing that is useful. Enlightenment will rid itself of this blemish. A closer examination of the positive result, which is its truth, will show that in that result the blemish is in principle already removed. We reach the end of this section now here in paragraph 573, in which Hegel tells us, this is really the crux of this passage here, that faith really amounts to a kind of unsatisfied or unfulfilled enlightenment. We saw at the very beginning of this in the discussion of the relationship between faith and pure insight, that they were both types of thought, that they are more closely connected together and related in their opposition to each other as modes of thought than either of them are to the world of culture that they surpass and transcend. So, how does faith become unsatisfied enlightenment? We've seen a lot of the development of this as Enlightenment carries out its critique of faith, but the absolute turning point is that faith, in effect, loses its content. He says, faith has lost the content which filled its element, the element of thought, and it collapses into a state in which it moves listlessly to and fro within itself. So there is still a consciousness of faith, but it's in effect a ruined consciousness. It's one that has lost its object, that no longer possesses the certainty that marks faith. It has become critical, but it hasn't gone beyond that yet. So Hegel has this beautiful metaphor here. It's been expelled from its kingdom, the kingdom of spirit in essence, right? It's been expelled from its kingdom, or this kingdom has been ransacked. The barbarians are no longer at the gates. They've already broken in, whether through the front gate or through the back door, and they've taken everything of value, all of the content that made faith what it was, that allowed it to have its attraction for one entering into it, and allowed it to have its fascination for one remaining within it. So he says the waking consciousness. What is the waking consciousness? We just talked about this in the last passage. The consciousness of the everyday, of the sensuous world. It is broken in, he says. It has monopolized every distinction and expansion of it, and has vindicated Earth's ownership of every portion of it and given it back to Earth, given it back to the world of sense, given it back to the commonsensical, the everyday, the person of understanding, we might say, the person of insight, the non-religious person, the secularizing person. What does it mean to say that? Hegel's being rather metaphorical here. Think about the sorts of critiques that were indeed carried out by those who were engaged from sometimes within religious institutions, sometimes from without, in criticizing religious institutions in particular, and also in general. They found ways to naturalize religion and to say, well, whatever you're calling beyond nature, the supernatural, that doesn't really make sense. You can't explain it. I mean, a great example of this is Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, where you see these three interlocutors, none of which who completely represent Hume, by the way. He's playing them all off against each other as sort of he's the voice of enlightenment, right? They're being made to combat each other and ultimately deprive each other of the content that they could have. So he says, faith is not on that account satisfied. This illumination has everywhere brought to light only single, separate, finite, endlich in the German, entities. So that what speaks to spirit, he says, is only a reality, something that is actual, without substance. Everything has been disconnected from each other. Does this sort of criticism sound familiar? I mean, it should, because if you think about the critiques that were made by so many people, whether religious or non-religious, about modern life and its mechanization and what capitalism does, you see these same criticisms being made, don't you? Oh, everything has lost its center. The beautiful illusions that we have been dashed. There's no connection between things anymore. Everybody has been atomized. Everything has been turned into a mechanism with interchangeable parts. That's in effect how the person of faith is feeling in relation to the Enlightenment without actually talking about those sorts of things. So in a way, the dialectic of faith and enlightenment is a precursor to the dialectic between, say, romanticism and whatever you want to oppose it to. So he goes on and he says, since faith is without any content, faith has lost its content. The spiritual world has been ransacked. And it cannot remain in this void, or since in going beyond the finite, which is the sole content, it finds only the void, faith becomes, as Hegel says, a sheer yearning. It's truth and empty beyond. Faith has to face up to what enlightenment turned the divine into, a void, absent of predicates, something about which all you can say is, it is. Or even, perhaps not even it is, but we must postulate this as something, even though we can never prove it. Does that sound like anybody that you might know from history, recent history before Hegel? Somebody who wanted to clear away knowledge to make room for faith, but what kind of faith? A faith that turns out to be, and just gives it away, a religion within the limits of reason alone. Well, that is what is going on here. And the question is, can this be enough for the consciousness of faith, this void? What becomes of faith? He says it turns into a sheer yearning. It's a desire that doesn't know anymore what it is desiring. And it's a desire that cannot be satisfied with a mere void. Because it's already a void, right? The void is within the consciousness of faith, and it's its object. That's a very unhappy place to be in many respects. So he goes on and he says, Everything is bestowed elsewhere. Faith has, in fact, become the same as enlightenment. It winds up taking on the same ultimate perspective as enlightenment. What is he defining as enlightenment here? The consciousness of the relation of what is itself finite to an absolute without predicates, an absolute unknown and unknowable. That's an interesting definition for enlightenment, isn't it? This conscious relation of something that is finite to the absolute. Probably not a definition you're going to hear from too many people, but it does make good sense within both the historical dialectic, as we see it playing itself out, and within the Hegelian narrative that is being portrayed here. So he says there is a difference, though. Enlightenment is satisfied enlightenment. Faith is unsatisfied enlightenment. It cannot be happy with being a void that reaches out to another void. That is not going to cut it. And yet it can't go back to, its old forms of action and belief, because those have been turned into merely finite realities that cannot symbolize the absolute. So he says, we're going to have to check, though. Here's where we make the transition into the next section of Spirit, which is called the truth of enlightenment, right? Now, up until this point, we've been looking at the struggle of enlightenment with superstition, and thereby with faith. Enlightenment, becoming successful, is now going to have to turn its powers upon itself and see whether it truly is satisfied. So Hegel says, we'll see whether enlightenment can remain satisfied. It is satisfied at this point. It's satisfied so long as it has faith to surpass, faith to put in its place. He says, the yearning of the troubled spirit which mourns over the loss of its spiritual world lurks in the background. So what we've got going on here, very interestingly, faith was able to be thrown down by the Enlightenment because it had so much in common with the Enlightenment. And that is going to turn out to be a bit of a Trojan horse for Enlightenment. That was the door through which Enlightenment could come in and ransack the spiritual kingdom of faith. But that door remains open, and that void, that yearning, now can come through that door and enter into enlightenment. And there may be some ransacking going on in the house of enlightenment, within the world, within earth as well. But that's going to happen in the next section. So Hegel says, enlightenment itself bears within it this blemish of an unsatisfied yearning as pure object in its empty absolute being, as action and movement, and going beyond its individual self to an empty and unfulfilled beyond, as an object with a content in the lack of the selfhood in the thing that is useful. So the very characteristics of enlightenment produce its own dissatisfaction. I mean, this should be sort of a cautionary moment to those who are the defenders, the contemporary defenders of enlightenment against whatever they pose as being, its nemesis. Postmodernism is a form of modernism that goes beyond this particular modern and sets up something else. And it does so precisely because the modern is an unfinished project, and it can go off in different directions. And it is self-aware. In this respect, Hegel is postmodern. And so is the Enlightenment when it stays true to itself. So in a sense, we can talk about a superstition or a faith of enlightenment that many people are living out by not taking cognizance of the fact that enlightenment relates itself to an absolute that is a void. And it does so in, Hegel says, determinate ways, as pure object, as action and movement, and object with a content. And we're going to see him working these out as we move into the next section. So he's going to finish this by saying, enlightenment will rid itself of this blemish. A closer examination of the positive result, which is its truth, will show that in that result, the blemish is in principle already removed. But we have to ask ourselves, is that really the case as we move now into the next section. And I'll remind you that after this Truth of the Enlightenment section, we're going to get to another very interesting part called Absolute Freedom and the Terror. So the Truth of Enlightenment is not going to actually keep us out of the terror. That is going to be something that culminates at the end of this process. Now, we can close the book on this particular section, seeing that enlightenment is now the main object for the phenomenologist to scrutinize as we work through it.